right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back today with somebody I'm always happy to see. She's a Harvard-educated clinical psychologist, social psychologist. Melanie Joy, beautiful human being. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy we're connecting. I loved talking to you last time, and we've been chatting for like a couple of minutes now, and it just was reminding me how much I appreciate your energy. And so I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Oh, well, we're doing the best with what we have in this world. We were talking before about how hard it is being an empathetic person in a world that's, completely unhinged and so you were recommending everybody say meditation, mindfulness, things like this, and you gave me a great recommendation. I'm going to see if I can, help my perception turn around. So really appreciate you coming on the show always. But but I wanted to ask you about this new book that you got coming out, or is already out. How to end injustice everywhere. So it's out. Everybody go out and grab it now because it's out. How to end injustice everywhere. So just tell me a little bit about it.
So, I've been, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows came out 12 years ago now. We had the 10th anniversary edition come out a couple of years ago. And, in that book, I really was looking at what I came to call carnism, the invisible belief system that conditions people to eat certain animals. And that book evolved out of my research. I was asking the question, how is it that compassionate people who are justice-minded, who care about animals, can nevertheless eat animals on a regular basis and not experience at least any obvious discomfort? How is it that all of us born into this carnistic world can basically check our critical thinking at the door, dampen our empathy, and act in ways that are completely in opposition to our deepest moral values without even realizing what we're doing? And that research led me to uncover carnism and to really, not just identify that there is this belief system, carnism, but that conditions us to act against our values and our own interests and the interests of others. But it's a belief system that is, made up of, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, psychological defense mechanisms so that rational, caring people can participate in irrational, uncaring behaviors without realizing what they're doing. What I had after that research was actually a blueprint for something much broader than just the psychology of eating animals, right? What I had sort of uncovered when I looked at carnism and I had deconstructed this system, my question was, what's going on here? Oh, wow, there's this belief system. Well, how is this belief system structured? What is the structure like? And what kind of mentality drives this belief system? How are we also like hijacked psychologically that we can participate in this unknowingly? But what I came away with was actually a blueprint for something much broader than carnism. And I realized that, all systems of oppression, we could call them unjust systems, systems that are, that cause us to act against what's just or what's fair, are structured in the very same way. And they're all based on the very same mentality. So whether we're talking about carnism or patriarchy or racism or classism, all of these systems share the same structure. And most importantly, all of them are based on the very same mentality. Now, I just want to make it clear that I'm not comparing the experience of victims, because doing that would be inappropriate and offensive to a lot of individuals, understandably. However, when we look at these systems, the systems themselves are structurally similar, and the mentality that drives injustice is the same, whether we're carrying out injustice or harm toward non-human animals or toward human animals. And so, fast forward 12 years, and I did a lot more research and wrote How to End Injustice Everywhere, that is really looking at this common mentality. And to really put this in perspective for listeners so that it's not an abstraction, if you think about some of the big injustices in the world, like really the most pressing problems facing the world today, from, climate change, animal exploitation, human exploitation, racism, patriarchy, poverty, unjust wars. And you look at some of the biggest problems in our personal lives, toxic workplaces, abusive interpersonal relationships, and so on. You can see that all of these problems share a common denominator. And that common denominator is relational dysfunction. It's dysfunctional or problematic ways of relating, relating between social groups, between individual humans, between humans and non-human animals, between humans and the environment. And of course, we're always relating to ourselves as well, through our self-talk and the choices we make that impact our future selves. Relational dysfunction is this common denominator. And what this means is that a common solution, it's not the solution, but it's a common solution to all these problems, is building what I call relational literacy, the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. And so how to end injustice everywhere is really looking at the structure of unjust systems and what I call the non-relational mentality, this mentality that causes us to disconnect from our rational thoughts and our empathy for others, human and non-human, and to drive injustices in the world and in our personal lives, in our own intimate relationships, in the choices that we make, that affect our future selves and so on. And to learn how to shift this way of thinking so that we can help create a more relational world where integrity is practiced and dignity is honored, and we just have a healthier world for everyone.
Yeah, and empathy is rewarded. But so you're saying that the victims also range in different shapes, colors, sizes, animals, humans, non-human animals, but the mechanisms behind the problems are pretty much the same, that lie in sort of the ego and lack of empathy in the oppressor.
Yeah, absolutely. And they lie, yes. So the mechanisms that enable abuse and oppression, injustice in all its forms, are the same. The mentality is the same. And this mentality is the mentality that causes even those of us who are working for justice, people who are working for justice for animals, justice for the environment, justice for other humans, right? This mentality is causing us to fight among ourselves. It's causing some of our really important justice movements to cannibalize themselves. So understanding this non-relational mentality not only enables us to better understand what needs to be changed psychologically, what the deeper psychological roots of injustice in the world are, so that we can target them more effectively and work to change them more effectively. And it also helps us to understand the roots of infighting in our own movements. And, because we very often practice these problematic ways of behaving and communicating. Communication is the primary way we relate. So relational dysfunction is most commonly expressed through non-relational or toxic communication. And so often, for example, you hear somebody who's advocating for justice for animals or for humans, and they're doing it in a way that's unjust. They're demeaning and berating people publicly in order to prove their point that we need to create a more compassionate and just world. And so it's like, and this makes sense, right? Because until we recognize the non-relational mentality for what it is, we're at risk of reproducing it. And this is actually what research shows, this way of thinking whereby we demean others in our minds. I mean, I can explain it and unpack it a lot more, but this particular way of thinking, it does cause us to disconnect from our empathy and act in ways that are demeaning to others, and it's contagious. Yeah. So you're online, for example, and somebody is publicly berating you or berating somebody else. Research suggests that you just reading that communication, or, let alone being on the receiving end of that communication, you're more likely to reproduce that behavior. Not just once, but multiple times. So, researchers say that this kind of communication spreads, quote, like the common cold. So if we don't recognize it, what we end up doing, this dysfunctional way of thinking, what we end up doing is we end up reproducing injustice, even as we try to end injustice. And, our movements are losing, infighting is costing our movements just a staggering amount of money and time and other resources.
What do you think are the most common arguments or conflicts that go along with infighting? Obviously people that don't think you're hardcore enough, or, what are some of the common things you see?
Well, I mean, we can keep it if you want. Why don't we keep our focus to infighting among animal advocates, right? Since
Right.
that's probably what most listeners, right, are coming from that background, and we can keep the conversation focused on this one area. Although infighting obviously is a problem everywhere. So infighting. Let me just define infighting first.
Sure.
Infighting is basically the same as any kind of fighting. It's what we could call outfighting. Right, except that it's directed toward members of one's own group. And basically, when people fight, we fight when we have a difference from somebody else, a difference of opinion, a difference of need or want or whatever. And we use some form of aggression in order to try to control that other person. Usually it's to get them to change, to be more like we are or whatever. So this is what fighting is. It's we encounter, we have a difference from somebody else, and we use some form of aggression to influence the other person to get them to change. Now, aggression is very often, not always, but often it's so subtle that we don't even notice that it's aggression. And it's most commonly carried out through shaming, through in some way communicating that this other person is less than, somehow like inferior, often morally inferior, maybe intellectually inferior, because they disagree with us. So when we fight, like in our movement, typically we fight. Let me actually back up and say two other things. Infighting is not in disagreeing. So disagreements between people, among people, within movements, within relationships, they're really important. They're normal, they're natural, they're necessary. We're different. Everybody is different, and people have different ideas and different opinions. So our problem is not our differences, it's how we relate to our differences. Disagreements are sometimes, really important. Challenging power in a movement, for instance, it's like when women are challenging, male power in a movement. It's important not to call these differences, and discussions about differences infighting, or we can be weaponizing this concept of infighting and silencing critical voices. So I want to put that out there. And I also want to say that infighting is not in bullying. In bullying is, or maybe the kind of infighting I'm talking about is less in bullying. In bullying, bullying is when one individual uses their platform to attack another. And a fight really implies that there are two or more people involved.
Yeah.
So, but the mentality is the same. So infighting, what we see, like infighting happens on the level of the movement as a whole, among vegans. So you've got advocates from all over the world, who might be attacking each other on social media or whatever. Infighting also happens between organizations that might be competing for recognition or for resources. And infighting happens within organizations and groups, right? You have teams work less effectively because people are fighting each other, or, in grassroots groups, people within volunteers might be fighting with each other within that group. And very often the arguments are organized around the idea that somebody is doing something that weakens the movement, right? So like if you look at infighting among vegans, you can really boil it down to like attacks are generally directed towards vegans who are perceived as somehow weakening the movement and therefore, quote unquote, hurting animals, like an enemy of the movement, an enemy of the animals. So I don't agree with your outreach strategy. I think it's counterproductive. I think it's like, it's not direct enough, or I think it's too watered down and you're selling out, so you're hurting the movement. Your demands are not clear enough, you're hurting the movement. So it's around outreach, how you communicate, how you do your outreach. Do you ask, for example, for people to reduce their consumption of animals, or do you ask for people to stop consuming animals immediately? So that's one area where infighting shows up, around outreach strategies that are, people perceive as weakening the movement. Another area you see a lot of infighting around is how to interpret the ideology. Like, what does it mean to be a vegan? Who gets to join the club and call themselves a vegan, right? Are you a vegan if you wear used leather? Are you a vegan if you don't check the label on your wine to see if it was actually And so you can see this is another area. And again, like people, ideologies are created by certain people at a certain point in time and in a certain context. And people and contexts evolve over time. So like everybody has different opinions about their own ideology. You know, Christians and Muslims and Democrats and Republicans and, you know, anybody you talk to who ascribes to any ideology will share that they have a different interpretation of the ideology than others, you know, within their same group. And that's okay. That's normal. That's human. We need to be able to have these conversations. The problem is not our differences. It's how we relate to our differences. And vegans can get very triggered by differences. You know, we have inherited this belief that if we're not united, we're divided, you know, and that comes from being such a tiny sort of ideological minority in the world. We get really scared and triggered. And like, you know, we see a vegan on television or something, you know, promoting something that doesn't seem to be like vegan enough to us or whatever it may be, or a vegan, God forbid, who's like stopped being vegan and like, oh my God, the movement's going down. This person's not representing us effectively and clearly. And it's like, no, I mean, but this is normal. This is people. This is the way people are. This is what happens. It's okay. We don't have to all be in agreement about everything.
Don't vegans forget that they're also human beings that are completely fallible as well. Like, give us some wiggle room here.
Well, there's that too. And so, you know, I would say that arguments, you asked what do vegans typically argue about or something like that. And this is usually where the arguments are directed, but it's not necessarily the cause of the arguments. You know, people argue because people argue. People, you know, vegans are people, and the vast majority of human beings on this planet, you know, have, I say this all the time, we have most of us have had to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use, and we haven't gotten a single formal lesson in how to be healthy relational beings, let alone how to communicate effectively. So when we have a difference of opinion or need, or we're triggered, you know, and upset, and the stakes are high, it's life and death, and we're already traumatized from being awake to the fact that we live in the midst of the global atrocity that is carnism and speciesism, you know, a little difference emerges, you know, a frustration occurs, and all of a sudden, you know, we unleash on each other. But this is what most people have learned. Like, most of us have learned that the way to get our needs met, the way to navigate differences, is by trying to force the other person to be more like we are. And that not only doesn't work typically, but it tends to backfire.
Yeah. So what are the reasons why it's counterintuitive, and why? What are the big signs that tell the people out there who are doing it? How are they the ones, the infighting? How are they actually hurting our movement?
Well, I mean, I think most vegans actually do realize that infighting is hurting the movement. Like, if you were to take a poll of vegans, my guess from my own experience over the years is that like probably like 99% of the people who respond would say, oh yeah, absolutely. Infighting is a problem, and I can see it hurting our movement. And they know why, you know, that we're not representing the movement well when we're like lashing out at each other publicly. Most infighting is happening publicly. You know, as I said, the primary way that we relate, let me back up. The primary manifestation of infighting, or what infighting is actually, is relational dysfunctional ways of relating, right? So this is a key problem. I mean, there are a lot of drivers of infighting, but one of the most important ones is that most of us have not built enough relational literacy to not engage in this relational dysfunction. And the primary way we relate is through communication. And so this is where infighting shows up, is in communication. And the primary way we communicate is online. The vast majority of communication that happens is online. So this is where we see the vast majority of infighting unfolding. And it's visible and it's public. And, you know, if there are non-vegan onlookers to vegans who are fighting with each other, obviously this doesn't make us great ambassadors for the cause. But vegan onlookers, you know, get increasingly frightened to speak about their opinions, to think outside the box, you know, of like maybe ways to strategize or conduct outreach or even think about veganism, because they're afraid of being on the receiving end of attacks. So most vegans know this. What most vegans probably don't know is that, like, the amount of money that's being cost. Like, if you look at analyses, and we have a new website, infighting.org. It's part of our broader End Infighting project. And the last chapter in my book, How to End Injustice Everywhere, is about infighting and how to end infighting. But it is, I mean, we're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars a year, being cost to the movement. This is like just financially, because teams are less productive, turnover rates are higher in organizations, animal organizations we're talking about here, which costs a fortune. Burnout rates are higher. People quit the movement, committed activists leave the movement. Activists that don't leave the movement become increasingly embittered and less effective ambassadors for the cause. We have higher rates because of infighting. One could argue that we have higher rates of various forms of illness because higher levels of infighting are higher levels of stress, and stress manifests in a variety of ways. So I could go on and on, but we've done a lot. My team and I have done a lot of research, and the costs are just staggering. And it's like, I always say, it's like, if we can imagine that like the vegan movement is a giant lifeboat, in the middle of the ocean, and we're just trying to pull as many animals out of the ocean as possible to save them and pull them onto our boat. And a few of the members of the crew, or a lot of the members of the crew, because most of us are participating in infighting, even though it's maybe in more subtle ways, are shooting holes in the bottom of the boat. And so our focus is, understandably very often on, recruiting new vegans. We want to get new vegans in and getting more money into the movement and more funding into the movement. And all these things matter. But we're funneling out a tremendous amount of resources, as the boat just floods. So the good news is that infighting is, in my opinion, it's only as much of a problem as it is because we've never really focused on ending it. Most people, and myself included for many years, I mean, it was bothering me, but I always kind of was like, oh, I don't have time to deal with this, and whatever, it's infighting, people fight. But for most of us, it's an abstraction. It's sort of like the causes are unclear and the cures are unclear. And so, this is why when I started to become aware of just how significant the problem is in teams and organizations and leadership and in the movement as a whole, I did a real deep dive into the problem. And the good news is that there are very clear, specific causes of infighting. It's not a mystery. And, quantifiable consequences, calculable consequences, and really specific, clear tools that anybody can use to become immediately proactive in helping to end the problem. And that's what the website infighting.org is meant to provide, this information.
Infighting.org, people, check it out. It's really going to be good. I would really assume that there's also a correlation, the older I get, or the longer you've been vegan, the more likely you are to have a more relaxed approach to, compromising with people that maybe you don't fully agree with, rather than, like you said earlier, arguing is actually a choice. And it seems like a lot of the time we like to argue on purpose. Is there any way that we're going to be able to get to the heart of this tribalistic kind of way of being? And how are we going to, what else can we do?
Yeah, well, I mean, you do make a good point where, the older you get, the less likely you are generally to be contributing to some of the toxicity anyway, because the older you get, the more relationally mature you get. If you're a person who's even remotely self-reflective, and is, working to be healthier in your own relationships, we learn as we go. We learn from the pain we experience and suffering we experience in our own relationships, and and hopefully we're learning and growing from that and becoming just more tolerant in general and more open-minded in general. But that doesn't mean we automatically have all the tools we need to help end infighting. I don't know that people argue because they want to. I think a lot of people argue because they don't know another way. And sometimes we can actually know another way, but not be able to make the right choice because we don't feel like we're in control of our behaviors. So, I mean, I'm sure everybody listening can relate to having a conversation with your partner and consciously, you don't want to hurt your partner. You love your partner. It's not a good idea to say things that are hurtful to your partner or to do things that are hurtful to your partner. But if you get hijacked enough in that conversation, if you get triggered enough, you will probably act against what you know better, and because you feel like you can't control yourself. And afterward, you might complain. You might apologize and say, "I'm really sorry. I just wasn't myself. Like, that was really out of character for me." So one of the causes of infighting, like one of the key drivers of infighting and of fighting more broadly, is dysregulation. And in our movement, we have, to my observation, quite substantially high rates of dysregulation. And for people who don't know what that is, I'll explain it. We are dysregulated when our nervous system is out of balance. Okay, when your nervous system is in balance, that's called being regulated. When your nervous system is out of balance, it's called being dysregulated. Everybody, you know what it feels like to be dysregulated. Everybody knows, because we're in and out of states of dysregulation all the time. You know, you get an upsetting phone call, or you're on hold with like Verizon or T-Mobile, wherever you are in the right for like 45 minutes, and then you get disconnected for the fifth time. Like, you're dysregulated. Yeah. You know, you get dysregulated because you haven't slept enough, and you know your nervous system feels like it's getting thrown off. You're dysregulated because you're overstimulated and you haven't had enough breaks in your day to like just slow down and create space in your brain. Or you get dysregulated even though it's a gorgeous day and you're walking down the street and all of a sudden looking at the beautiful leaves changing color in autumn, and all of a sudden you have a flashback to like a horrible image you've seen of animals suffering, or you see a quote unquote meat truck driving by. So everybody is in and out of dysregulation all the time. When we don't understand dysregulation, and we don't recognize, especially when we are dysregulated, and know what to do about it and know how to self-regulate, we can get more and more dysregulated, and we dysregulate others. So here's the thing about dysregulation. Number one, when somebody is dysregulated, they have less access to their rational faculties. You're basically less rational, even if you're slightly dysregulated. I mean, if you're extremely dysregulated, this is sometimes referred to as being flooded, and then you really have very like limited access to your rational faculties. So we are less rational, and we have less connection to our empathy. You know, think of it this way: if somebody is drowning, they're not going to want to talk politics with you. They're basically just grabbing onto anything that floats. And when we're dysregulated, you know, basically our survival, our sense of like, you know, being under threat is kicked up, and we're more in survival mode than we otherwise are. So this is something to keep in mind. So if you're talking to another vegan about a disagreement that you're having, and you know the stakes are high, and you're thinking about life and death, and this other vegan is upset because you're not agreeing with them, first of all, they're probably getting dysregulated in this conversation. You might be getting dysregulated in this conversation. Our normal strategies for trying to get other people to change, which is usually like, if I can just make them feel bad enough about what they're doing, they'll finally come around, tends to dysregulate them further, right? So this is one reason that we have high rates of infighting, I believe, which is that we have high rates of dysregulation, because frankly, just being vegan in a dominant animal eating world in and of itself is dysregulating. Like, yeah. You open your laptop and you read the news, and you walk out your door and you see meat trucks driving by, and you see trucks filled with body parts, and your family is eating like a pepperoni pizza around you. I mean, I could go on, but it's dysregulating.
Dysregulation is our default setting in the world.
In some ways, for some people, and particularly when you're awake, like to what's actually going on in the world, like it's really hard not to get dysregulated when you know that animals are being tortured and killed every second of every day. And like, you can spend the rest of your life working to end that, and you'll probably never live to see animal liberation. So, you know, not to mention the fact that, like, you know, most of the people in the world, you know, we're basically trying to clean up the mess made by other people in the world, and, yes. And like, we're ridiculed for it, you know? And so, you know, even by some of the people who are closest to us, we're completely invisible to them in terms of like what's near and dear to our heart, and sort of the actual heroism of the work that we're engaging in. Right. I mean, if we were saving cats and dogs, it would be a whole different story. We're working
in triage, and it's just a mess all the time. And so everybody's just easily triggered at any time.
Yeah, that's much better said, actually. Thank you. You just completely summed it up. The thing is, though, that dysregulated people dysregulate people because dysregulation is contagious. So if you've got like a team, or a group of vegans working together, or just vegans who are part of some online community or whatever, if you're around somebody who's dysregulated, there's a good chance that you're going to become dysregulated. Like, just imagine, for example, that, like, I don't know, say you're regulated, you're sipping your morning cup of coffee or tea, and you start reading your emails to start the day, and then some activist that you've been working on a campaign with, or whose petition you agreed to sign, like you have this email from them, and it's like all caps, urgent, 5 exclamation points after that, and then that's all it's going to take. Forget about even reading the text in it. You went from regulated to dysregulated in a second, and like the chances of you, when you're on the receiving end of behavior that is not relational, right? It's not, in some way, maybe it's dysregulating, because it's just somebody who's like having big feelings, maybe it's dysregulating because somebody is not communicating in a way that's actually thoughtful and compassionate. You're more likely to reproduce those behaviors later on in the day to other people. And so dysregulation spreads. And it's a major cause of infighting because it's really hard. You can know all the tools to communicate effectively, but if you're dysregulated enough, it's going to be very hard to access those tools. So one of the things, we have on the website is, information about how to self-regulate, how to recognize when you're dysregulated in the first place so that you can hit the pause button and take care of yourself before just, rather than just pushing through your day.
And you keep saying hijacked, which is this great way of describing what happens to the brain on a daily basis with negativity all around you. But, it kind of, hijacking is the lack of control. Somebody steals the control and is guiding your brain around. Do you think this helplessness or, lack of control is what exacerbates humans to be so combative so easily?
Yeah, when we are, even when we're hijacked, which basically is another way of saying that we're blended, like we have the sense that we're merged with whatever part of ourselves, emotion, we can even say, let's just simplify it even further. When we have an emotion in ourselves that's activated, anger, for instance, fear, sadness or grief, when that emotion when we become identified with that emotion, meaning we start to we feel it strongly and we look at the world through the lens of that emotion. We don't think, for example, I am feeling angry. We don't recognize anger as nothing other than an emotion in us. We've actually merged with the anger. We don't say I feel angry or I am feeling angry. We say I am angry. I and the anger are one.
And when we're
identified, right. And when we identify with an emotion, that's tricky. That's when we really get, we really struggle to be able to make choices that are thoughtful and conscious. And it's a problem for everybody. Yeah, of course, not just for vegans. But there are some great, very simple strategies to reduce the chances that we will get identified or blended with an emotion or with a thought, and, something as simple as saying, I am feeling angry, or better, a part of me is feeling angry. Like if you are feeling really angry, to literally say to yourself, wow, a part of me is feeling angry, because it's never 100% of you. Your anger is literally just an emotion that's existing within a part of you. It's not all of you, ever. No matter how angry you get or whatever, there's always a part of you that is beyond the emotion. The emotion is literally just an energetic activity inside of you. So, so you start to unblend from it a little bit. But yeah, all people have this same struggle, and building self-awareness is a huge part of what we need to do in order to help reduce infighting in our movement and just to be more effective ambassadors for the cause. Because the very same mentality, this non-relational mentality that I keep referring to, and if you want, I can unpack that and talk about what that actually looks like.
Yeah.
This non-relational mentality that contributes to injustice, unjust systems, and contributes to infighting. It's the same mentality that causes us to communicate with non-vegans in a way that's counterproductive and turns them off. If we want to just simplify this and call it toxic communication, like communicating in a way that's like we can experience as toxic. When we're communicating in a toxic way with a non-vegan, we're less likely, unlikely to invite them into the conversation. We're communicating in a way that's toxic with a vegan, we're unlikely to have a productive conversation with them.
Yeah. Careful, everybody. Careful. Infighting.org, right? Check it out. Amazing thing. Also, How to End Injustice Everywhere, which sounds like a very valuable book. The links will be in the description. Look, I love talking with you. Every time you come around, you always brighten my day, and you always bring a smile to my face, and you help me get over some of the horrific realities of living on this cold and indifferent world. So thank you for coming. Do you want to add anything before we go?
Yeah, I sure. I'll say thank you so much, and it's a pleasure. Just quickly, just so people know when I'm talking about this non-relationality, so it's not an abstraction for them. It's and this is in the book, and it's on the website on infighting.org. But I talk about practicing the formula for healthy relating. When we want to relate in a way that's healthy, that means we practice integrity, treating the other person the way we would want to be treated if we were in their position, right? And honor dignity. We see the other individual as no less worthy of being treated with respect than we or anybody else is. So you practice integrity and you honor dignity, and that leads to a sense of security and connection in your interaction and in your relationship. That's the formula for communicating in a way that's healthy, for relating in a way that's healthy. And the opposite of that is what's non-relational. So that's something to keep in mind, as listeners are kind of wondering what I'm talking about with toxic or non-relational. And I will say that, you are totally right. It's challenging to live in this world if you have any degree of sensitivity, and if you happen to be a sensitive person, which is true for a lot of people in our movement, it's even more challenging. And honoring that, recognizing that and honoring that, and giving yourself what you need to stay regulated is really, really important. So if you can commit to your own regulation, especially if you're a sensitive person, that means you get dysregulated more easily. Maybe it's bright lights, it's loud noises, it's, violence, whatever it may be. Protect your boundaries. Give yourself permission to do whatever you need to do to regulate yourself on a regular basis. And you give yourself a great gift, and you will also give this movement a great gift, because you protecting your boundaries and being regulated will enable you to use the gift that your sensitivity is in a way that helps heal the world. And you won't end up, burning out and suffering more than you, already are. So you can check out, there's a website on the highly sensitive person, HSP. If you think that you're a highly sensitive person, and learn more about this personality type, because it's really, really important to have this self-awareness. But give yourself permission to protect your boundaries so that you can live in a way that feels healthy and sustainable to you.
Yeah. And try to treat each other right, people. Do the best you can out there, because we are all we have. I want to thank Dr. Melanie Joy. Always a pleasure to talk with you. You are such an inspiration and such a nice person. And I want you to come back and do this again, okay?
Yeah, thank you. And same to you. Really, I mean it. Okay.
Well, we'll sign
thank you
off
for
to
having
everybody
me.
out here. Bye. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.